Welcome back. Assalamualaikum and good morning. Welcome to the keynote session. We are proud to have with us today an eminent speaker, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak. My name is Dr. Azlina and I will be the moderator for this session. A gentle reminder to the delegates before I introduce our keynote speaker for today. Kindly post your questions or comments for our speaker in the chat box and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our speaker, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak, is currently the Rector of the International Islamic University Malaysia and he is also the immediate past President of the International Association of Universities IAU. He is a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, the World of Art and Science, and the World Academy of Islamic Management. In 2017, Professor Dzulkifli was conferred two prestigious awards, the Tokoh Akademik Negara, National Academic Laureate, and the Gilbert Medal. He was then conferred Professor Emeritus by USM in 2018. In 2019, he received an honorary doctorate of Dakwah and Islamic Management by University Science Islam Malaysia USIN and the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Race with neck ribbon from the Government of Japan. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak to present the keynote entitled The Use of English in the Post-Pandemic Era. The floor is yours, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azlina. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Greeting of peace, salam sejahtera, and a very good morning. Indeed, I am very delighted and very blessed to be invited for this very auspicious occasion. And I want to thank the organizer and also the Ministry of Education for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on a very important subject. As you have heard from the generous reading of my CV, there is nothing to do with English language per se. So in other words, we are taking a risk by inviting a person who do not know what this is all about. But nevertheless, I'm very excited when I see the word new normal, when I see the word post-pandemic. and certainly the word English language, because these are the crux of the issues that all of us will be facing, whether we like it or not. Doesn't matter what profession you have, what specialty are you having, but at the end of the day, we will converge to these problems. And the more we talked about it, the more we create understanding, the easier for us to find a solution, and more importantly, to create a better ambient for the future as far as our students is concerned. So I'm taking this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Some of it may be provocative to you, but nevertheless, I think this is the world that we are facing today, unless and until we are able to confront some of the controversies within us, we probably will not be able to go very far into the future. So that was given to me is this title, The Use of English in Post-Pandemic Era. And because of the time constraint, I will talk about some of the issues and the challenges for the 21st century. The word 21st century is still valid, although we talk about post-COVID as though we have sort of right off the 21st century. The 21st century is still there, but how do you then navigate within the 21st century and given the problems that we are in, right? So let me begin by asking what is the use of language in general. Okay, and let us also look at the time when corona is a nice word. Yeah, corona refers to a product. Corona refers to a range of food that people would want to buy. In other words, you will never imagine that we will go out and buy corona now. Yeah, but at that time, corona means crown, and everybody is going after corona or going for corona because there is something that they benefit from. And I want to look at language from that point of view before the COVID, before the post-pandemic that we're going to talk about in a few minutes' time. Yeah? From my own observation, I think there are many things that we can think about. One is you use language because you want to create shared values, shared platform, common platform, basic standards so that we can have a kind of a position that we understand one another. Creating understanding, therefore, is a major benefit of using language in the right way. Once you have these shared values, then you can also create a shared culture where there's common beliefs, there's just basic practices that we can understand from one another, and more importantly, to have this collective action. Now, collective action, as you are aware, in the corona pandemic era now, a collective action is something which is important. If any individuals who wants to work on their own without taking care the collective actions of others, then chances are we will not be able to what we call circum this issue of the coronavirus. Yeah, when you build collective action, then you start to build relationships, and relationships means about the common lifestyles that we have, how we understand way of life, and more importantly, this collective understanding. And this collective understanding, as I've mentioned earlier, is probably the very basis of why we need to exist and live together. Yeah, so there's peaceful coexistence because we understand one another. We can tolerate because our togetherness, and also we can bridge whatever divides there are between us. I mean, you can imagine the humanity, there's so many diversity, there's so many differences, but yet with a common understanding, we can build a kind of a platform that we will understand and appreciate what humanity is all about, regardless of color, regardless of race, regardless of belief, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Given then, the more important thing, we begin to develop, co-create what I call knowledge that all of us can share, reaffirming or confirming the values and the beliefs that we have got. And finally, we begin to construct an action that will benefit all of us. And this is where we are now, I think, when we talk about another concept called sustainable development. Sustainable development, I think you know, is an agenda of United Nations beginning from the year 2000 until now, that we want to build a kind of an inclusive, a biodiverse sort of environment. In other words, not an inclusive, homogeneous, but we respect biodiversity, we respect cultural diversity, and we have this idea of transdisciplinarity. In other words, no matter what your specialty are, what your discipline is, you can sit down together and construct a kind of a solution moving forward that is very much community-based, community focused, in fact, not individualized or not nationalized in the sense. Yeah. So these, I think, the broad idea of why I think language is important, because it makes us a better human person, make us more dignified, and give us a sense of higher purpose of why we are here. Why do we do education? Why do we learn language to start off with? And this, I think, is a big picture that most of us will forget, because we tend to focus on a very narrow spectrum of what a particular language can do, English, for example. Yeah. But this particular what you call benefits now, fortunately, is enhanced by the coronavirus. The coronavirus tells us we need this understanding. The coronavirus tells us we need to work together. The coronavirus tells us we need to create a platform that we can understand and work collectively, as I've mentioned earlier. It has to be sustainable. It has to be inclusive. It has to be community focused, if not on a worldwide basis. So in other words, this value of why we use a particular language, English, for example, is enhanced by this post-pandemic sort of criteria that we are facing today. And this is, I think, the basis of my discussion with you. Now, in other words, we want to preserve diversity as much as possible. Given the pandemic, given whatever virus we are facing, the alpha, beta, delta, whatever is given to us, the diversity is important so that we are ensured that the value system with this really is something that we can depend on one another. So diversity and language, I think, needs to go together, and this is how we're going to argue this case moving forward. But if you go on the ground and see what is actually happening in the context of language alone, in the so-called new normal, you'll be surprised that we are not in a good position when we talk about diversity. Yeah. To start off with, I think one language dies every 14 days. Every 2 weeks, according to some research, one language will die. In other words, there'll be a loss of diversity, there'll be a loss of inclusiveness, there'll be a loss of shared values within a culture, and the world is getting more and more monolithic, more and more homogeneous. To myself, is more and more boring. In other words, we are doing the same thing, we are seeing the same thing again and again, day after day. In fact, as days goes by, more language dies, and we get more homogeneous. So you get a more monoculture kind of way, and we begin to create very artificial common belief, because my beliefs has been taken out, and therefore your beliefs become something which is uncommon to me. And therefore you see this fake news and all the things that we are facing today in terms of misinformation, disinformation, some of the basic practices. Just talk about the coronavirus alone. There are many uninformed sort of practices using this drug, using this way and that way. And these are the ones that are now creating us apart, because we have no longer these collective actions that we talk about. Yeah. From there, I think we begin to see a very minimal sort of relationship. It's almost one-dimensional, one style of living, and that style of living sometimes is imposed on other people, on the weaker culture or on a subservient culture. It used to be the colonial tendency or the hegemonic tendency, and basically there'll be a very sort of a brittle relationship between what is imposed on us and what do we believe internally among themselves. All this, yeah, are giving us a kind of a future that is actually uncertain, a very superficial understanding of how do we need to coexist, how do we need to tolerate one another. And even then, I think we are creating new divides. One of the new divides they are going to create is basically the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. As though we have not enough divides in terms of technology, in terms of culture, in terms of race, in terms of religion, we are now creating another one, which is called the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. People are talking about these people who have got passport. They can go everywhere and anywhere they want. People who have no passport on vaccination, they need to be confined to a home or a place where they cannot even interact with other people. Now, we are creating more divides among ourselves, and I've just mentioned that diversity is important. Homogeneity is not a good thing, but this is what we are facing today. And then knowledge becomes a kind of a soft power that we learn this knowledge because we are dominated by certain values. All right. So just talk about the vaccines alone. Now, everybody, I think, do not understand much about the vaccines. But because it is now, quote unquote, imposed on us to a certain level, that we have to take it, whether we like it or not. And that's why there's so much argument in this world today as whether this vaccine is useful, or if it's useful, to what extent. Do we need a third dose, or do we need this and that? There's a lot of discussion, a lot of confusion, because the creation of knowledge is not equilibrium. It's not equilibrium among the people who knows and the people who don't know, the people who are vaccinated and the people who are not vaccinated. At the end of the day, instead of getting a sustainable way of looking at this, we are getting into something which is unsustainable. In other words, the loss of relevance. For example, in my context, in my values, in my cultural understanding, I don't see what I need to see. And therefore, we begin to exist in silos, compartmentalization. The relationship that we talked about becomes brittle. Sometimes it is broken right off, and we are beginning to focus on individuals, if not regions and stuff like that. Again, the vaccine story tells us we now have got concepts of vaccine nationalism. In other words, some countries, particularly the well-to-do countries, has monopolized the vaccine for themselves. They have vaccinated more than 80% of their population, whereas the population that is not well-to-do in developing countries, they have not vaccinated even 10% of their population. And yet we talk about the common platform of humanity that will confront a COVID environment in the kind of new normal that now do not exist. So these are the issues that I think we need to start off with before we even go and understand what language is all about, what any subject matter is all about. What are we doing in terms of the platform that we have created so that we can exist together, so that we can tackle the issues together at the same time. This is a world that was, but given the coronavirus, this world now becomes segmented. There's a lot of argument between them, and the world do not exist the way it ought to exist. All right, and the cry for help is not only in one language. The cry for help is in many languages. And until and unless you can understand what this cry of help is in the context of their own culture, then you will not be able to understand how to solve this particular problem. That is the new normal that I see now, that we need to grapple with, that we need to come to an understanding, and then start to contextualize what is the role of languages. Do language mix people coming together, or do language divide people and make them live separately the way we do not want to see as far as the future is concerned? So if this is the given, from my point of view, if this is what is given, then I think we have a lot more things to do, rather than coming up to very sort of a prescriptive way of doing things in terms of pedagogy, in terms of curriculum, in terms of what have you. We need to find what is the context, what is the new issue in the so-called new normal that we are facing as we move along, as this COVID environment gets more and more complicated as we see today as far as Malaysia. So what is the context that I want to bring to you? So as we talk about English language as a globalized language for the world, we need to understand that only about 400 million people speak English as what as a first language. It says more than half of this living in United States, followed by United Kingdom. United Kingdom even have much more lower numbers of the first language speaker. The first place where English was spoken. And just to give you a kind of a contrast, if you look at Bahasa Malaysia, there are about 270 million people who speaks Bahasa Malaysia. And not very much different from the number who speaks English as the so-called the first language, right? Now, English is the third largest language by numbers if you compare it to Mandarin and Spanish. So again, you find that there is another competition coming along in terms of the use of language being the first language and native speakers, right? Now, what is surprising to me is that non-native speakers, at least by the early the year 2000, outnumbered the native speakers. I think you know this. In other words, the people who promotes English language are not the Englishmen themselves. It's us. It's me and you. We learn this language, and we are the promoter of this language. The three of us as compared to one of them. If we go back to our own indigenous language, then this English language will just collapse. In other words, we are the one that decides where is the position of the English language today, not the Englishman. And I think there is a kind of realization that we need to understand. When we decide something, what is the consequence on us rather than what is the consequence on them? I think that question has not been asked in a very serious way. So the estimate includes second language speakers that varies from 500 million to 1 billion, depending on what statistic you look at. Yeah, but eventually, I think it is this combination of the native and the non-native speakers that makes this English language works. All right, and sometimes it doesn't work in a very ethical way. Some of these are being forced onto us in the form of colonization, in the form of the Industrial Revolution now, in the form of the internet. You cannot go to internet without understanding English. In other words, there is already a kind of a constraint. We have no choice but to go into it because the structure is made in such a way. I'm not saying it is wrong, but I'm saying basically, are we comfortable with this kind of situation that we are facing today and will continue to face in the future? These are the consideration, I think, that we need to look at when we talk about the English language. It is not a benign thing. It could be also malignant to a certain extent, depending on how you see the geopolitical world is playing today. For example, if you look at Mandarin and English, if these are the two dominant world power, then where are we going to situate ourselves at the end of the day? Maybe at the end of the century, which is the language that we need to major in, because the geopolitical situation has changed. It is not just academic, it is not just a Minister of Education, it is a whole nation. In fact, it is a whole world that needs to decide where we need to go. Just to give you another statistics, yeah, if you look at these numbers of people who speaks English, it's a little bit dated, but again, like I said, English is number 3 compared to Spanish and Chinese, just in terms of numbers alone. And I also want to bring your attention to, we've got 7 billion now around that, yeah, but we have got 7,000 language that is, around the world. Some of them are very small speakers, including, I would include also sign languages at the same time, right? Just to keep this in mind, but I just also want to contextualize again, where is the Malay language if you take the macro sort of dimension? We are just about slightly better than maybe Hindi. Okay, and that is the kind of position that I think I need you to understand, because all of us in Malaysia think that Bahasa Malaysia has no value because the volume of people who speaks it is not many. Yeah, and in fact in ASEAN, instead of using Bahasa Malaysia as a lingua franca, ASEAN prefer to use English. But the number of English speakers in Asia and the number of English speakers in Nusantara perhaps is about the same. But yet the bias is on English because we think the local language in Nusantara has not the worth that we ought to give it to them. Just to, again, to say what I'm saying, if you take ASEAN alone, the only places that do not speak English well is Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. The rest, either they speak wholly English, or wholly Malay, or part Malay and part English. The rest, in other words, the language is still very vibrant, and indeed it is the 6th most spoken language after Chinese, English, Spanish, Arabic, and Russian. I'm bringing this to you just to give a point of reference. When you say English is good, yes, we understand it is good, but what about Bahasa Malaysia? And I'm glad Dr. Rafi explained that Ministry takes Bahasa Malaysia as a dominant language and English as a supporting language as well. Now, what is the issue that I'm troubled with? I'm troubled with this language dominancy that we see today. The trend is now there is a generation shift to more dominant language. In other words, it is almost suicidal for other languages which is considered not dominant. And that includes Bahasa Malaysia, Bahasa Indonesia, and Bahasa Nusantara, right? And if we look at this statistic, there are a number of language that is dying. And this language that is dying is something of concern to us. For example, if you look at Asia, the living language is about 2,300 and about 1,000, or almost 50% is kind of dying. Kind of in trouble. All right. So there is this shift that I was mentioning to you about. One language dies every 2 weeks. These are the languages that will die. And these are the regions that will suffer. The closer you are to a dominant language, Africa, for example, a lot more threats that you are going to face. Yeah, Africa not so much. Africa, what you call Americas, Pacific are facing those kind of a trouble that you are moving into a dominant language, that you are leaving your own language and your culture behind. Why it is important? It is important because each language has its own value. Each language has its own knowledge that we need to live by, and each language has got its own norms that will enrich the world over, not just your own particular community. Just to give you a kind of a mental picture where language are so-called endangered, these are basically in this part of the region, which is very close to North America, and these are the parts which are also being colonized very much during the Second World War and so on and so forth. So this is the situation now as we talk about languages, particularly English. Where do we situate ourselves given this kind of a critically endangered scenarios that we're facing today? Right, let's go into the issues. So in the 21st century, when you talk about the new normal, what are the challenges that we talked about? Yeah. And the challenges are basically very much a decision that we need to make. We did about the individual country, individual nation, individual community, or is it about universality? Is it about humanity? What is the balance between the two that we need to arrive at? As culture get globalized, what happened to the local culture? Do we just let it go, or do you just forget about this? And he said the risk of forgetting the unique character of an individual human being, or could be individual community, is very, very high, given the problem of anonymity that is created by the contemporary development. Contemporary development means this is a kind of development that I talked to you about, which is not inclusive, which is very biased to a certain culture, certain location, and in fact, certain individuals. We need to decide where we want to go. What is the role of the individual character, be it a nation, be it a community, or be it the individual themselves? Yeah? We need to decide whether the traditional wisdom is still important as compared to the so-called modern rationality, particularly when we talk about technologies, this information technology that we talk about. How much of this has somehow or other undermined traditional wisdom? Or is traditional wisdom at all has a role in the use of language? Yeah, and I'll talk to you a little bit about this. Where is wisdom and where is rationality in the context of trying to decide where do we go as far as English is concerned? To be more specific in terms of spirituality and materialism, when we talk about the language, does it present the soul of the community, or is it something which is just superficial? Another, the use of words. I was just trying to explain to Azlina earlier. When you talk about the word happiness, which is now very much part of this problem of mental health. You need to be happy so that your mental health is good, right? But the word happiness translated into our language, what does it mean? Is the word happiness in Malay seronok, gembira, ataupun bahagia? We've got 3 levels of this. Is it just seronok? Seronok means momentary. Yeah, you give me something and I'm happy. That happiness is just momentary. Yeah, as compared to bahagia, is a long-lasting sort of happiness that do not depend on anything that you give me. I'm just internally or intrinsically happy because of my makeup, because of my culture, because of my values that sustain me that way. I don't need to be given anything. Yeah. And sometimes orang yang bahagia ini, the people who are happy internally, could be the poorest of the poor as compared to the richest of the rich. So when we talk about in terms of spirituality and materialism, the use of language must have got a bearing on this. As far as I can see, when we talk about language today, it is basically just about material definition. There's very little spiritual definition, and therefore we run into sort of a misunderstanding of how this language impact the person that use the language itself. Yeah? The need for competition and the need for cooperation, so that you provide equal opportunities. Again, language can be a barrier in this particular respect. Right? You would demand a person to know this particular language, and therefore he's not good enough until he is now able to subscribe to the kind of job opportunities that you have reserved it for them. And this reconciliation now between what competition and what collaboration is something that is being argued around the world, where the competition alone is enough to sustain, or how much of it is in terms of collaboration. You can compete collaboratively in a healthy way, rather than a very draconian way that one is a loser, the other one is forever a winner in this particular kind of the world winner takes all. Yeah. So we talk about the knowledge explosion within ICT. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and the kind of ecocentricity as opposed to the anthropocentricity. Is it us with our environment, or is it about just us alone? The environment does not matter. And some languages, and I will demonstrate to you later, it is just about us. The environment does not matter at all. And so happen, English language is built as one of those languages that do not care about the environment per se. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So what is the way ahead? If you want to make this language to be equivalent to everybody else, in terms of diversity, what do we need to do? Or do we subscribe this idea that one is more dominant than the other, rather than looking at it in a kind of a balanced portfolio? I want to go very quickly into something that is already forgotten, because we talk about the 21st century and we keep on defining 21st century. I see a lot of words coming out, 21st century classroom, 21st century curriculum, 21st century this and that. And more often when you talk about 21st century, we seem to think that technology is the panacea of it all. As long as you've got this technology online, we'll call it whatever it is, we are already on the 21st century, not knowing that at the end of the day, it creates another problem for us. Let me see how I can explain this to you, right? In there's four pillars of learning as far as UNESCO is concerned for the 21st century. I think you know this is learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. And all of this must coexist in a kind of a balanced way. In other words, what you know will help you to live together. What you do will help you to be. They are all interrelated. Yeah? But fortunately or unfortunately, I think in many education systems, we only talk about two pillars of learning. Learning to know and learning to do. And I think language is also built in this particular construct. It is an instrument of understanding, as I've mentioned earlier. It helps you to produce ideas, decisions, and memories. And hopefully it will then translate into a kind of an application for a variety of situations. That's a diversity that we talked about. And we seem to end there. We are not kind of bothered to know about what is living to live together. In other words, in Malaysian school, we know what to do, we know what to know, but we cannot live together. Why? Because we have not developed the understanding of others, their history, their tradition, their spiritual values. I'm back to this imbalance of spiritual and material. You teach language just because of learning to know and learning to do, and this is a construct basically economically driven. You need this language because you need to be functional in an economic environment to produce something, to earn a livelihood. It's not about life itself. It's not about the other. You know, sometimes you go into a situation that you sometimes don't understand your working mates because they are the other, and your interest is only making money for yourself, not the environment that you need to build to the language that you have. More so when you talk about spirituality, inner peace, mind and heart. This becomes a very crucial thing now when you talk about the post-pandemic, particularly in the context of mental health. Where do you situate this as far as language is concerned? All the language have no role in making this thing happen in the context of inner peace, mind, spiritual values, and so on. And that will go back to another issues, which is about learning to be, in other words, learning to know who you are. And that language must be comfortable to you before you can know who you are. I cannot use a different language to describe me that do not have meanings to me. I talked about the word happiness just now. Yeah, I will not describe I'm a happy person in the context of my own culture, because there is different way of understanding what happiness is all about. Now, where do we teach our students language that it be about this learning to be who they are, what sort of language will describe them the best? And this now becomes a very heightened sort of concern. When we talk about coronavirus, the pandemic, these are the two issues that we need to grapple with. Yeah. And I don't know whether our strategy in pedagogy and curriculum includes this at the same time as a mainstream, not just as a by and by. As much as we learn to know, to do, how does this apply to live together and to live to be, so that we can get the balance that I talked to you about in the context of knowledge, and especially the use of language as it is. So for the last 2 years, UNESCO has been trying to describe what are the futures of education. Are we part of this? And he says the futures of education is to reimagine how knowledge and learning can shape the future of humanity and the planet. Is our curriculum about the humanity and planet, or is just our curriculum still about the industry and jobs and stuff like that, which is important, but it misses the whole big idea of humanity and the planet. You can get a good job, but that job will destroy the planet. That's not the kind of job that we want. Yeah, we can have a job, but suddenly it is, working against humanity. Some of this you can imagine what sort of industries are this. Yeah, are these not the kind of things that we want to do? The context will be that the future of humanity and planet. Do we have the language for this? Do you have the language to talk about humanity and the planet, given the situation we've got? Be it English or whatever it is, right? So it tells us the world that we want. What is that the world that we want as far as the UNESCO futures is concerned? Yeah? It's quite difficult to describe the world that we want, but I think it's easier to describe the world that we don't want in this context now. We don't want lockdowns. We don't want to be isolated. We don't want to be siloed. We don't want to be attacked by a virus that we can't even see or don't even know for sure. This we do not want, right? And if this is what we do not want, how do you communicate this using the language that we've got? All right? How do you communicate that you want to stop the virus from attacking us? Already earlier we see, the use of social distancing vis-a-vis physical distancing. The language of social distancing hardly describe what we want to get the student to practice, which is physical distancing. Only later we opt for the word physical distancing because it is more real. But many parts of the world are still using this word, very elusive, social distancing, which is used during the time of leprosy in the 5th century. We are not facing leprosy, we're facing something else. And therefore the language needs to change, but the language hardly change. Yeah? How do you describe people that they must use this? Not because it is inconvenient to you, because it is something that we need to do to protect humanity at the same time, not just you. You don't care about yourself, we also don't care. But because if you are also a threat to humanity, then we need to care, right? How do you tell them one is not enough, two is important now because of the Delta variant? Who is communicating this? What language do we use? Let alone the other things that we talked about, yeah? The many things beyond just washing hands and wearing masks and stuff like that. There are many things that we need to talk about and argue as far as the use of technology and so on and so forth. Who is communicating this? Who is communicating in the context of these very elusive symptoms that sometimes exist, sometimes do not exist? Yeah, I deliberately reverse all this because without these words, you cannot differentiate what this person is doing, what this person is doing, what this person is doing. There seems to be, one is, have a red lipstick here, one is covering his mouth, the other one is just coughing. This probably doing the same thing. But the word will describe you, they are different. This one is basically having a chest pain. This one is having a cough. This one is breathlessness. Now, what language do you use? I just reversed it so that without these words, without this language, we can't even differentiate these three very different sort of behavior, as it were. Right? So these are the issues that I think we need to grapple with. Not just decide this language is the best, but does this language adequately describe the situation we are in the post-normal, and does it bring a solution to make a world a better place? That is, I think, the question that we need to ask, and then we go for the best language that solves the problem, that makes the world a better place to live, and that will be the consideration as far as I can see. Now, people then say, okay, you have got a problem, now we've got technology. Yeah, technology has moved leaps and bounds. Why can't you use technology? It's neutral anyway. So everybody talks about when the virus comes in, let's go online, right? And I think Dr. Rafi just described, online is good, but online has its own problem. And that problem has been there for a long time. It only surfaces recently when we talk about mental health. Mental health issue has been there for a long time, but it doesn't surface because there's no depth to it. Now when we talk about mental health, there's suicide. There's many other things that comes on, and suddenly it occurs to us that mental health is a serious problem. It's not just cough and cold anymore. You cannot hide it anymore because the statistics are coming up higher and higher almost every day and throughout every part of the world, and mainly is because of this isolation, because of the use of technology in a very improper way, and so on and so forth. Yeah, give me another 5 minutes, I'll finish, and maybe we can have some discussion. Reality is this: when you talk about IT, the work by Alexander Steele that talks about how information age threatened to destroy our cultural heritage. Few of us think about it. Yeah? As you go into the internet, each time you go into the net, into browse, we are leaving our culture behind because our culture does not get represented in the internet, particularly the smaller cultures, the less dominant cultures. And here's what Alexander said. One of the great ironies of the information age is that while the late 20th century will undoubtedly have recorded more data than any other period in history, it will also almost certainly have lost more information than any previous era. Loss of information means loss of knowledge. Loss of knowledge means we are getting into a bind that we have very little alternative to move out, because knowledge and culture are two things that cannot be separated. You lose a culture, you lose a knowledge. And African has got a proverb, yeah, that when a wise man dies, a whole library burns down because the knowledge is within him. And this is a knowledge that has been losing out because of technology, the way it is structured, the way it is dominant over certain cultures throughout the world. This, I think, is a concern for me, because information age seems to take over. We now talk about even technology take over in a family where 5 people sit and 4 of them are on a device, yeah, and speaking to other people around the world when there are 5 of them sitting around a table. They don't even communicate, and this describes largely the younger generation that we're facing today. But I just saw this book that talks about maybe 500 years ago in Malacca, not so far away, we used to speak 84 languages. Read this book. Yeah, read this book. Why 500 years ago we used to speak 84 languages in a place called Malacca, which is not so big, but now we are insisting only 1 or 2 languages. Why not 84? If we can do this 500 years ago, when there's no technology, when there's knowledge is not even enhanced, why can't we do it today? What has shifted? What has made things happen? Yeah, that's Malacca during that time. You can see the kind of ship that comes in, the cosmopolitan nature of Malacca then is something that you cannot imagine. You read this book, you know why people speak 84 languages, because of the diversity, because of the interaction, because of the cosmopolitan nature of that place, that you need to learn this language in order to survive, right? You have got descriptions of Malacca in different languages, not only in the local languages. So the question I'm asking myself, do we talk about one language or do we talk about many languages? Many means not 2 or 3, but beyond that. Yeah, we may not be able to master them all, but at least we can communicate and understand what these languages mean to us in terms of its culture, heritage, and values. Where are we in this particular context when we talk about English? I want to finish with this. It's rather controversial, but these some of the readings that I said when you talk about what they call the industrial intelligence, which we are now in, compared to the primal intelligence, which we have inherited since we were born. Yeah, but this primal intelligence is now superseded by this industrial intelligence, and the language is used to this. Let me just read the statement by the author. It says, Western education typically emphasizes an activist intelligence, another intelligence that emphasizes seeking and manipulating things in the world. And interestingly, he said, the English language itself encourages this attitude in 2 ways, by calling everything but people things, and by having static noun-based descriptive words of entity instead of verb-based terms like 3 instead of 3 being. Yeah, human definitely, human you call human being, but 3 they use the noun rather than the verb, according to this author, 3 being. The latter is more common in indigenous languages. In other words, indigenous languages at this point is more inclusive, is even more progressive in recognizing that the 3 is a being, not a dead trunk that needs to grow and then you can cut it wherever and whenever you want. There is no soul in the 3. The indigenous culture, indigenous languages recognizes that 3 is a being. So English itself makes it easier to treat other entities as object to be acted upon instead of agent with its own lives and purposes. This is what sustainable development is all about. I talked to you earlier. Sustainable recognize that every agent has got its life and purpose. We only need to know and to find out. The Maori, for example, look at water as a being. You cannot even pollute the water without being charged because it's almost like killing another person when you pollute the water. That's the indigenous knowledge of the Maori. We have similar, but we have now just postponed it because we have been dominated by a different language that tells us different value system, not the value system that we know. Indigenous language often has more verbs than nouns, and the opposite is true for English. In contrast, the indigenous worldview, including the language, does not divide the world up, but see individuals as unique. It is a right brain directed, attended to relationships and the awareness of energy. I want just to show you the contrast. When you take another language in, it changes everything. It's just not about speaking. It's just not about, inheriting it for some economic purposes. It changes the whole life structure, understanding what life is all about. Yeah. And these authors go on saying English speakers are taught to label and categorize things, grouping them into units, which is a left brain function. All right. I find that it has a detached kind of a thinking, and that explains why the Flynn effect on rising IQ. What does it mean? The Flynn effect tells us that human mind is much more adaptable and malleable than we might have thought. Once exposed to the modern industrial society, which is the industrial intelligence, we think about the world in a different way than our ancestors did. So there's a departure between what is innate, which is primal intelligence, as compared to what is imposed, which is the industrial intelligence as well. Malcolm Gladwell, the book on outlier and quick thinking or something like that, and he writes this: if whatever thing that is that IQ test measure can jump so much in a generation, because we see IQ seems to be increasing generation by generation, it can't be all that immutable, and it doesn't look at all that innate. In other words, Flynn effect tell us that IQ may not actually be what we think it is, instead of being measured of a natural unlearned intelligence. I want to underline this. It is something that is shaped by education we receive and the society we live in. Now, what is this natural unlearned intelligence that is now related to English as a way it is taught to us? Yeah? I just want to finish up with this. this last slides. Yeah, when we talk about the unlearned natural intelligence, we are looking at a very indigenous way of understanding certain things that belongs to that community or belong to that culture or civilization. And this is worldwide. I just give you one example. Yeah, the word ikigai in Japan talks about a meaning, a reason for being. Why do the Japanese exist, or why do they are being in a way? Because of ikigai, the whole concept of ikigai, the whole structure and understanding of what ikigai is all about. In Africa, they have the word Ubuntu, which means literally about humanness, the universal bond of sharing that connects all humanity. You see how rich this word is. The word Ubuntu talks about connectivity and humanity at the same time. Yeah, we have got another Norwegian word or Danish word that talks about huga. You don't have to rush or to control anything, which is now our preoccupation. We want to control everything. Yeah, don't look for perfection, but strive for your own happiness. And this word happiness, in their words, is different from the English happiness. It is a translation to English. Swedish have got an understanding of lagom. It states about not too much, not too little, just right. It's about the balance, which is almost equivalent to what the yin and yang is all about. The positive, the negative, and the light and the darkness, and so on and so forth. This is never captured in any language beyond their own language, including the English language. And therefore, how do you translate ikigai into English? How do you translate Ubuntu to English? If you don't translate this, then you're going to lose it. But if you translate it, you're going to vulgarize it. You're going to lose it as well. In other words, I think these are the indigenous languages that we need to defend and protect, because it brings us another set of values, set of knowledge, and a set of wisdom that the English language can never capture. And my last point is basically, Malaysia has got its own equivalent of ikigai, Ubuntu, lagom, and yin and yang, and it is what we call sejahtera. Yeah? For those of you who remember, the falsafah pendidikan kebangsaan talk about kesejahteraan diri. At the end of the education, we want to produce a person yang sejahtera dirinya. But what is sejahtera? I can bet you, if I asked you, maybe 90% of us has no inkling of what sejahtera, that must be delivered through education. Yeah, how can you deliver sejahtera through education when you do not know what sejahtera is about? The worst, I think, you convert it into things like well-being, prosperity, which is not what sejahtera is all about. And yet we keep on talking about salam sejahtera, sejahtera Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And this is where I think the role of language in its indigenous context becomes important. English has got its own role, but I think English now needs to understand and be sensitive and respect the indigenous meaning of words, so that they don't overwhelm it, so that they don't try to colonize it, or don't try to throw it out because there's no equivalent in an English language which is so dominant. I accept it is an international language, but international language is not what we are looking for. We are looking for a solution to a world problem. And if that language cannot deliver, then I think we really need to introspect it and look how we can do better in using that language moving forward. So Azlina, I will stop there. I'm sorry if I take a long time, but we started late, so I hope we can have some time for Q&A if that's permitting. So thank you very much. I apologize if I upset some of you, but the keynote is meant to upset you so that you can be provoked and to think outside of the box, as Dr. Rafi said in this morning. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah, and a greeting of peace.
All right, thank you, Professor Emeritus Dzulkifli Abdul Razak, for the inspiring and interesting keynote. All right, I guess Professor Dzulkifli has actually highlighted several issues. Yeah, several issues pertaining to how English language is positioned in the context of post-coronavirus era. I think we only have time for one question due to the time constraint. Yeah, Prof.
Yes.
So I'll just state one, and we will make it. I'm so sorry because of the time. This is actually from Noraimi Farhani, University of Nottingham. I'll just be selective in what she wants to ask. Actually, When you refer to the 4 pillars of education by UNESCO, she would like to ask your opinion on how schools can actually promote learning to live together, and how can that be reflected in the current online teaching era?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think if I were to given a choice, I will start with learning to be. I will not start with learning to know and learning to do. This is what we do in preschools. Yeah, you want to know who you are. Who is Azlina? Is this lady in front of me? And you want to know who is Azlina. So I think we start with an internal strength of understanding who we are. At the end of the day, Azlina, when we go into the question of mind, for example, the word mind, misalnya dalam bahasa Malaysia, there's no word mind in bahasa Malaysia. We use the word minda. Minda is not a Malay word. We don't have the word intellect. We also borrow from the English. But we've got our own word called buddhi. Buddhi is a combination of mind and intellect. It's a very hybrid concept, which is very progressive and very advanced, that it takes the whole thing of minda and mind together. But we never teach buddhi to our students. We think buddhi is archaic. We think buddhi is no relevance because the modern word is minda and intellect. Dalam kita punya falsafah pendidikan kebangsaan pun kita katakan Jerry is I is intellect. I could have used the word buddhi there, and it serves a very specific idea of what learning to be is all about. And that's why kita punya construct as a Malay, we talk about budi pekerti, budi bahasa, budi bicara. That is learning to be. In other words, the person of Azlina has got this character of learning of how to be budi bahasanya baik, budi pekertinya baik, dan budi bicaranya baik. Now, once you have these 3 elements, you can live together. We don't have the skill of even talking politely to other people or behaving in a decorum to other people and having this balanced budi bicara. We don't have the skill to do that. You cannot live with anybody. You know, you see people quarreling with one another, shouting with one another, which is not about buddhi. So how do you put this in a behavioral form at the very infant level, that it becomes part of you? The moment you have this budi pekerti, budi bahasa, budi bicara, then you can live anywhere around. That's why the Malays dulu can go. I'm going to have a seminar this afternoon tentang orang Melayu menjadi perantau. They can go anywhere and live anywhere. You have the Cape Malays, you have the Colombo Malays, you have them everywhere. Why they can survive? Because of this budi pekerti, budi bicara, and budi bahasa. That makes them a livable kind of a group of community that sometimes compromises a lot of things. So the way we structured our education system needs even to be questioned if we are interested in this new pandemic. But I feel a little bit disappointed when we just take the old structure and change the name and turn a little bit of direction. I think the whole thing needs to be revised. So when you have this living together, then you begin to easy for you to learn. You can learn from other people. Then you're learning to know, learning to do becomes part and parcel of that culture. So I don't know whether I answered this question, but this is certainly a very interesting question for us to rework what education is all about. If you're really interested in the new normal, the new in the real sense of new, not new in the sense of somebody said it is new.
Yeah, very true.
Okay. So
I
hope that we can still continue the conversation for Malaysians who wants. I'm interested to hear some of your point of view. Anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I really hope that this will help you to change for the future, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Prof. All right, we have come to the end of the session, and on behalf of the English Language Teaching Center, I would like to extend our sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak for making the time to be with us this